attacking their worldview. And if their worldview, or last week I think I used the phrase sacred story, if you challenge a narrative that is near and dear to them, in the case of at least some Jewish persons, the Holocaust narrative is near and dear to them and amounts to a religion for a certain segment of the Jewish community. For another gentleman who attended this class for a while, his understanding of the United States government and especially the United States military was such that to challenge its dignity and honor was an offense not just to him personally, but to a very sacred story for himself. We all tend to have sacred stories, and some hold them closer to their bosom than others. But I want to point out, in terms of these sacred stories, that in the last third of the 19th century, public schooling was established in the United States of America. And the principal purpose of the establishment of public schooling was to establish a common American narrative. It was to establish that the United States was your mother land. It was to establish that your sacred story was going to be created, molded, and fostered by the state. Prior to that time, and to a significant extent still, one's sacred stories are adopted from one's parents, from one's tribal community, from one's physical community, but it was a very intentional process to replace that local creation of the sacred story to becoming a bureaucratic or national generation of the sacred story. And for a person who has not, I don't want to say this in a pejorative fashion, in the sense, if a person has not moved beyond the teenage stage of adopting his or her parents' narrative and then coming up, the introduction of an alternative narrative is going to be very concerning and very upsetting. So I wanted to present the issue that came up is that, does the government lie to us? And Howard Zinn answered the question definitively, governments lie. And he was right. Zinn is the author of the People's History of the United States and did a great job on it. I can't come up with his name, a prominent sociologist, he did not adequately evaluate the messages of 9/11, but Zinn was still a very good historian and identified a host of places where the government has in fact lied to us. I thought I'd use this afternoon not to discuss any one element of those lies in detail, but to simply survey a few of the lies. And to start out with that, I'm going to show you a little documentary that James Corbett made, and it's entitled Debunking a Century of Lies.
If, as the old adage has it, the first casualty of war is the truth, then it follows that the first battle of any war is won by lies. Lies have always been used to sell war to a public that would otherwise be leery about sending their sons off to fight and die on foreign soil. In times long past, this was easy enough to accomplish. A proclamation by a king or queen was enough to set the machinery of war in motion. But in the modern age of democracy and volunteer armies, a pretense for war is required to rally the nation around the flag and motivate the public to fight. That is why every major conflict is now accompanied by its own particular bodyguard of lies. From false flag attacks to dehumanization of the enemy, here are all the examples you'll need to debunk a century of war lies. This is the Corbett Report. In 1915, the RMS Lusitania, a British ocean liner en route from New York to Liverpool, was sunk by a German U-boat 11 miles off the coast of Ireland. The ship's sinking, which resulted in the death of 128 of the 139 Americans aboard, became a symbol of German evil and helped psychologically prepare the US public for their country's eventual entry into World War I. But every facet of the story of the Lusitania, as it has been presented to the public, was a deliberate lie or a lie by omission. The boat was not a purely civilian vessel carrying 3,813 40-pound unrefrigerated containers of cheese and 696 containers of butter, as the official manifest held, but gun cotton, in keeping with the shipment's stated destination, the Royal Navy's weapons testing establishment. It was not sunk by the German torpedo boat, but by secondary explosions from the munitions the ship was illegally carrying. It was not the victim of a cowardly German surprise attack. The German embassy placed a warning notice about the Lusitania in 50 American newspapers right next to Cunard's own listings. And the American ambassador to England at the time, Walter Hines Page, wrote to his son 5 days before the ship was sunk, asking, "If a British liner full of American passengers be blown up, what will Uncle Sam do? That's what's going to happen." So what did the official cover-up of the incident conclude? That the dastardly Germans had waged a perfidious sneak attack on an innocent peace boat, of course. And the rest, as they say, is history. A little over 2 decades later, America's entry into World War II came when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, killing over 2,400 American servicemen and civilians. But far from an unprovoked sneak attack, as the official government-approved history would have you believe, Pearl Harbor is best understood as a conspiracy to motivate the American public for war by first provoking and then allowing a Japanese strike on American targets. This is not even a controversial idea. It was commonly understood and discussed by many in the Roosevelt administration at the time. Henry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, noted in his diary that just the week before the attack, President Roosevelt had told him, "We were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday," and then solicited Stimson's advice on how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Around the same time, Roosevelt sent a message to all military commanders stating that the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. So how did FDR and his administration provoke the Japanese into attacking? In late 1940, Roosevelt ordered the United States fleet to be relocated from San Pedro to Pearl Harbor. The order incensed Admiral James Richardson, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. fleet, who complained bitterly to FDR about the nonsensical decision. It left the fleet open to attack from every direction. It created a 2,000-mile-long supply chain that was vulnerable to disruption, and it packed the ships in together at Pearl Harbor, where they would be sitting ducks in the event of a bombing or torpedo raid. FDR, unable to counter these objections, went ahead with the plan and relieved Richardson of his command. Then, in June 1941, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ikes wrote a memo advising FDR to embargo Japanese oil in order to goad them into war. There might develop from the embargoing of oil to Japan such a situation as would make it not only possible, but easy to get into this war in an effective way. Roosevelt followed 3 weeks later with an order seizing Japanese assets in America and effectively preventing Japan from purchasing much-needed American oil, which at that time accounted for 4/5 of Japanese oil imports. The provocations had their intended effect, and the Americans listened in on Japanese war preparations via radio. They received warnings of an imminent attack from diplomatic officials and military attachés. The attack was even predicted by the Honolulu Advertiser days before it happened. But all of these warnings were ignored. Even today, nearly 80 years after the events, new documents and memos continue to be found showing more warnings that Roosevelt and his administration deliberately ignored in the run-up to the attack. FDR got his wish. The Japanese attack was successful. 2,400 Americans died, and the nation, outraged, responded by rallying around the flag and jumping enthusiastically into war. But the Japanese themselves were no innocents when it came to lying their way into war. 10 years before Pearl Harbor, in 1931, Japan was looking for a pretext to invade Manchuria. On September 18th of that year, a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army detonated a small amount of TNT along a Japanese-owned railway in the Manchurian city of Mukden. The act was blamed on Chinese dissidents and used to justify the invasion and occupation of Manchuria. When the lie was later exposed, Japan was diplomatically shunned and forced to withdraw from the League of Nations. The League of Nations fell apart precisely for its inability to prevent World War II. Its successor organization, the United Nations, engaged in its own war lies shortly after its creation to ensure that it would not meet the same fate. The Korean War, waged under the UN flag and sold to the public as a virtuous mission to save the South from the North's communist aggression, was on its face a war that should never have happened. The division of Korea into North and South was not the organic decision of the Korean people, but a plan that originated in an article in 1944 in Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which suggested dividing the country up and putting its administration in the hands of the Allies, including the Soviets. When the newly founded UN put that plan into action in 1945, Korea was arbitrarily divided along the 38th parallel, with the US administering the South, and the Soviet Union administering the North. Neither was the war itself the organic result of decisions taken by the Korean people. In 1949, Owen Lattimore, a member of the Carnegie and Rockefeller-funded Institute for Pacific Relations and an advisor to the State Department on East Asian issues, wrote, "The thing to do is let South Korea fall, but not to let it look as if we pushed it." In a speech at the National Press Club the following year, Secretary of State Dean Acheson placed Korea outside of the US's defense perimeter of the Pacific, stating that any attack that took place outside of that perimeter would have to be dealt with under the Charter of the United Nations. Taking this as a green light, the North Koreans, heavily fortified and equipped with Soviet military aid, invaded the South. The war began on June 27, 1950, when the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for members to provide military assistance to restore international peace and security in the area. The Soviet Union, being a veto-wielding member of the Council, could have vetoed the resolution and prevented the UN from engaging in the war, but they abstained from the vote altogether. When General MacArthur, leading the UN forces, managed to repel the North right to the Chinese border, he was prevented from completing the mission by Truman, who would not authorize any operations north of the Soviet-held 38th parallel unless there was no chance of confrontation with either Chinese or Soviet forces. MacArthur, shocked by this development, wrote in a letter years later, "Such a limitation upon the utilization of available military force to repel an enemy attack has no precedent either in our own history or, so far as I know, in the history of the world. To me, it clearly foreshadowed the tragic situation which has since developed and left me with a sense of shock I had never before experienced in a long life crammed with explosive reactions and momentous hazards." In the end, the bloody Korean conflict ended not with a peace deal, but a ceasefire. Not with the reunification of the Korean peninsula, but with the establishment of a demilitarized zone to keep them separated. Nearly 3 million civilians died during the fighting, and the country was torn to pieces, all in the name of a military action under the UN flag that should never have escalated into war in the first place. In August of 1964, President Johnson was preoccupied in finding an excuse to justify a formal escalation of American military involvement in Vietnam. That excuse came on August 2nd, when the USS Maddox, a destroyer supposedly on a peaceful mission in international waters, reported a surprise attack from North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Just 2 days later, it reported another attack. Johnson responded by launching retaliatory strikes and signing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, thus formally launching the Vietnam War. Years later, it was revealed that the story of the Maddox II had been a tissue of lies. The Maddox was not peacefully drifting near Vietnamese waters, minding its own business. It was part of a covert electronic warfare campaign assisting the South Vietnamese in launching attacks on the North. It had not been attacked out of the blue on August 2nd as originally reported, but in fact had fired first. And, as even the NSA's own internal publication, made available to the public for the first time 40 years after the incident, concluded, the second attack on August 4th had never taken place at all. But these were mere details, and just like the facts about the Lusitania and Pearl Harbor, these details were suppressed long enough for the event to have its intended effect, rallying the public for war. The Six-Day War in 1967 between Israel and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan is yet another example of a war which was justified for reasons that were later exposed as lies. When Israel launched an attack on Egypt's airfields on the morning of June 5th, they initially claimed that it was a defensive strike and that Egypt had struck first. But this was an easily proven lie, and the claim was quickly dropped. Next, they claimed that the attack was preemptive self-defense, and that Egypt and its Arab allies had been preparing to strike Israel. But multiple Israeli officials, including Yitzhak Rabin, later admitted that Egypt had not been preparing a war, or even interested in one. And then, in the most outrageous incident of all, Israel attempted to get America involved in the war by attacking the USS Liberty, a U.S. technical research ship collecting electronic intelligence just outside Egypt's territorial waters at the time of the war. The attack, carried out by Israeli fighter jets and torpedo boats, was relentless. The Liberty was strafed and torpedoed repeatedly, with the crew sending distress messages and even hoisting a large American flag so there could be no doubt as to their identity. The Israeli attack was finally called off an hour and a half into the assault. Israel, caught in a blatant attempt to sink an American ship, offered an apology for mistaking the identity of the vessel. But it was no mistake. In 2007, the NSA declassified intercepts confirming that the Israelis knew they were attacking an American ship, not an Egyptian ship, as their cover story is maintained. Even mainstream historians now characterize Israel's attack on the Liberty as a daring ploy by Israel to fake an Egyptian attack on the American spy ship and thereby provide America with a reason to officially enter the war against Egypt. But the incident was soon memory holed, and to this day, the Six-Day War is portrayed as an act of preemptive self-defense by the valiant Israelis against the dastardly Arab aggressors. By the 1990s, the post-Vietnam public was growing increasingly wary of calls for war in far-flung corners of the world in countries many had never heard of. And so it was that in 1990, when the politicians and their deep state controllers required the American public to be motivated to wage war against Iraq for its invasion of Kuwait, they hired a literal PR firm to sell an even more brazen set of lies to Joe Sixpack and Jane Soccer Mom. The most famous of these lies revolved around Nayira, a young Kuwaiti girl who sparked international headlines for her shocking testimony before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus in October 1990. In a tear-stained speech, she told a harrowing story of the horrors she witnessed being committed by Iraqi soldiers at a Kuwaiti hospital where she was volunteering.
The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
It's difficult today to understand just how important this testimony was in setting the tone of the debate about whether America should commit military forces to defend Kuwait. It was reported breathlessly on the evening news, and it was repeated by President Bush on not one or two occasions, but 6 separate times in the lead up to war.
Babies pulled from incubators and scattered like firewood across the floor.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
Then, when the Gulf War resolution was making its way through the House, the incubator story was raised in Congress.
Now is the time to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait.
And then again in the Senate. The vote passed, and combat operations formally began in January 1991. The only problem? Nayira was not some anonymous Kuwaiti girl, but, as a subsequent CBC investigation discovered, she was Nayira al-Saba, daughter of Saud al-Saba, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. Her testimony had been written for her by Hill & Knowlton, a PR company hired by the Kuwaiti government-supported AstroTurf organization, the Citizens for a Free Kuwait, to help sell the Gulf War. And the Congressional Human Rights Caucus that held the hearing where Nayira gave her testimony? It was later found to be a Hill & Knowlton front itself. As everyone knows by now, the second Gulf War in 2003 was also built on lies. We all remember the lies about Saddam's WMDs and the way that story was sold to the public by Colin Powell at the UN. But this time, the media took the driver's seat in the campaign to sell the war to the public. The New York Times led the way with Judith Miller's now infamous reporting on the Iraqi WMD story, now known to have been based on false information from untrustworthy sources. But the rest of the media quickly fell into line, with the NBC Nightly News asking, what precise threat Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction pose to America? And Time debating whether Hussein was making a good faith effort to disarm Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Reports about chemical weapon stashes were reported on before they were confirmed, although headlines boldly asserted their existence as indisputable fact. And any media personality that showed skepticism about the claims being made, even wildly popular ones like Phil Donahue, host of MSNBC's then highest-rated program, were summarily removed from the air.
Scott Ritter is here, and so is Ambassador Bartlett.
You had Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector, who was saying that if we invade, it'll be a historic blunder.
Yes, but we didn't have him alone. He had to be there with someone else who supported the war. In other words, you couldn't have Scott Ritter alone. You could have Richard Furl alone.
You could have the conservative.
You could have the supporters of the president alone. And they would say why this war is important. You couldn't have a dissenter alone. Our producers were instructed to feature 2 conservatives for every liberal.
You're kidding.
No, this is absolutely
Instructed
true.
from above?
Yes.
We now know that, in fact, the stockpiles did not exist, and the administration premeditatedly lied the country into yet another war. But the most intense opposition the Bush administration ever received over this documented war crime was some polite correction on the Sunday political talk show circuit.
You and a few other critics are the only people I've heard use the phrase immediate threat. I didn't. The president didn't. And it's become kind of folklore that that's what's happened. The president went...
You're saying that nobody in the administration said that?
I can't speak for nobody and everybody in the administration and say nobody said
Vice
that.
President didn't say that?
If you have any citations, I'd like to see them.
We have one here. It says, some have argued that this is you speaking, some have argued that the nuclear threat from Iraq is not imminent, that Saddam is at least 5 to 7 years away from having nuclear weapons. I would not be so certain.
Mm-hmm.
Close to imminent.
Well, I've tried to be precise and I've tried to be accurate.
No terrorist state poses a greater or more immediate threat to the security of our people and the stability of the world than the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
The WMD story blew up in the neocons' face shortly after the war, but by that time they had already succeeded in their plan to reshape the Middle East. But for the would-be controllers of public opinion, a valuable lesson was learned. Human rights and protecting the innocent is a more effective lie to sell to the public to motivate them for war. So when it came time to sell the war on Libya to the public, the UN-backed, NATO-led aggressors once again donned the cloak of human rights by turning to none other than the UN's Human Rights Council. The process that launched the intervention was begun by a coalition of 70 non-governmental organizations, which issued a joint letter urging the UN to suspend Libya from the Human Rights Council, and for the Security Council to invoke the so-called responsibility to protect principle in protecting the Libyan people from alleged atrocities being committed by the Libyan government. In a special session on the issue on February 25, 2011, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution affirming the NGO's recommendations. The resolution was adopted without a vote. The Security Council immediately passed resolutions 1970 and 1973, authorizing the establishment of a no-fly zone on Libyan military aviation for the protection of civilians and the delivery of humanitarian assistance. 3 days later, using the resolution as its justification, the US, UK, and France began bombing the population of Libya. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, began working on the legal basis for the invasion. He drafted the request for the court's judges to issue an arrest warrant for Gaddafi for crimes against humanity. Although NATO forces were already engaged in an invasion of the country on the basis of undocumented allegations by a group of NGOs, Moreno Ocampo's request was not issued until May 16th. On June 28th, the day after the judges agreed to issue the warrant, Moreno Ocampo participated in a press conference in which one reporter asked about the evidence that Gaddafi had ever engaged in the atrocities he was accused of.
I advise you to read the application of the prosecutor's office, many pages, I think it was 77 pages. We describe in detail the facts, most of it is public. And the judges also decided, analyzing the evidence. So, of course, we are prosecutors and judges, so we rely on facts. So we prove the crimes. That's what we did.
Although the document that Moreno Ocampo urges the public to read to understand the evidence of Gaddafi's crimes is indeed public, and is 77 pages long, the version made available to the public has been heavily redacted. In fact, of the 77 pages, 54 of them have been redacted, comprising the entire section of the document dealing with the evidence for the charges themselves. The most sickening part of this war lie is just how obvious it was. No one involved in this charade cared about the well-being of the Libyan people. Not the press, not the politicians, not the ICC prosecutors. And as a result, today, 7 years after the destruction of Libya at the hands of the United Nations-sanctioned NATO saviors, open-air slave markets are running in the country that the human rights crusaders once pretended to care about. False flags, provocateur conflicts, fake news, and fake human rights crusades. Throughout the last century, a host of methods have been employed to keep the public playing the military-industrial complex's game. And over that century, the blood of untold millions has flowed as a direct result of these war lies. Truth is the first casualty of war, as they say. But if we desire peace, then we must confront the liars with our knowledge of these war lies. And armed with this truth, the public finally stands a chance of stopping the next war before the warmongers can conjure it into existence.
It's impossible in a video like that to cover all of the interesting facts, but I want to mention three that James does not cover. One concerns World War I. In 1915 and 16, Woodrow Wilson, American bankers and American industrialists, especially after the Lusitania, wanted to get into the war. Public opinion simply wasn't ready for it. They didn't, very wisely in my opinion, they didn't want to get involved in a foreign war. Some of the newspapers were for it as well, but there were a number of very important newspapers owned principally by American Jews who were opposed to it. And the American Jewish publishers' point of view was this. American Jews despised the Russian Tsar, essentially for what is reported to be the Russian treatment of Russian Jews. And I say reported because as you get more and more historians, you find out that something has been inflated to the size of a balloon. But letting that pass. The American Jewish publishers wanted the Tsar to get kicked badly, and Russia was in league with England and France in World War I. When Lloyd George sent an emissary to the American Jewish community, and the prominent American Jewish community representatives met, what better day to meet obscurely, they met on Christmas Day in 1916. Our source for this information is Benjamin Friedman, who was an insider's insider in the American Jewish community at that time, and became absolutely disgusted, I don't know at what, became absolutely disgusted with the behavior at that time, and has since told the American people a great deal about what was going on at that time. But Benjamin Friedman reported this meeting, and up to that time, the American people were opposed to war, primarily because not enough influential newspapers were inclined toward war. On Christmas Day, that changed, and the decision that Lloyd George made was known to the Germans. At least there's good, what's the word for, the evidence for my statement is this. When the decision was made to offer the Jewish community Palestine, that was made in October of 1916. And oddly enough, coincidentally enough, conspiratorially enough, it was on October 1916 that the German High Command made its first survey of the German troops to find out how many and where German Jewish soldiers were serving. Up until that time, German Jewish soldiers were of the same status as any other German soldier. But in October 1916, the German High Command wanted to know where they were. At that point in time, they came to consider German Jews as an internal threat in Germany. Woodrow Wilson declared war after the additional newspapers came on board 4 months later in 1917. An additional element that Corbett does not deal with is Pearl Harbor, and that the United States, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and quite clearly Roosevelt and his cabinet knew that they had broken the Japanese code, so that they knew what the Japanese were planning. They kept this information from the Navy command over Pearl Harbor and over the Army command in Pearl Harbor. There was not an Air Force at that time. There were airplanes, but there was not a separate force. They quite intentionally kept that information, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, these two individuals, I had their names written down elsewhere, were court-martialed. After the war, very quietly, they appealed that and were exonerated. Their court-martials were reversed. But it had the necessary public opinion effect of justifying the response and having scapegoats to take the guilt for it. And the third element that Corbett, I'm not saying he ignores it, there's just too much material, but concerns the issue of Muammar Gaddafi and supposedly his abusing his own people. Libya had the highest standard of living in all of North Africa before Gaddafi was taken down. He had a social welfare system for his people that rivaled any in the West. If he made a political mistake, it was in not being as open and as generous with the eastern tribes of Libya as he was with the central and western tribes. He made at least one crucial mistake. He was planning on establishing a central bank in Libya to serve as a central bank for all of Africa with the gold standard, and that was absolutely verboten by the central bankers of the West. This is whole history, and in one sense it's ancient history, so I want to call attention to what some modern journalists have said. And I'm going to take a little vignette out here. The Washington Post has been a mouthpiece for the Central Intelligence Agency for decades, and has been pretty widely known for at least a couple decades to that effect. And the two reporters who leaked the evidence against Richard Nixon were given information that was available from a CIA agent. What I'm saying is that I'm not including Woodward and the other one?
Bernstein.
Thank you. Woodward and Bernstein in the category of researching journalists. They were mouthpieces because there was a reason for destroying Richard Nixon's presidency. But Abbey Martin, Eva Barrett, and Vanessa Beeley are very good journalists, and they take research seriously. So I'm going to show you, before I talk about these three journalists, I want to call your attention to a history book written by an elderly professor of history now, James Lowen. And it's Loewen, because I was going to have a little video vignette here, but one of my disasters this week was that the computer that is capable of downloading videos from the internet is giving me trouble. So I'll mention him individually. He's written a book that is variously entitled Lies My Teacher Told Me. Now, if I'm wrong on that, it's because of the aberrant title that the interviewer gave. But James Lowen is the author, and it is about the lies that are contained in American history books and in the teaching of American history. As a side note, this is important because a people or a culture do not know who they are unless they know their own history. And if they are fed an incorrect history, they have an incorrect idea as to who they are and who they are perceived to be by the rest of the human community. And in his book, James mentions several elements. And this is just in the matter of the interview, so I'm certain it is loaded with additional facts. But it is not at all widely known that the United States and Great Britain were involved in the Russian Revolution on the side of the whites against the reds, against the communists. And Lowen mentions that these troops were withdrawn in April of 1920 or 21, I think 21, on April Fool's Day, as a matter of fact. And that's the only reference he found to the American and British presence on Russian soil during the Russian Revolution, when in fact it's a major aspect of the battle between the whites and the reds. Another is, and this is across the board, so if you take a textbook of American history, and he perused at least a dozen of them, they are faulty on just the points that I am bringing up now. Another is the case of Reconstruction. When he was at one point in time teaching at Tupelo College in Mississippi, an all-black college, and the black students' understanding of Reconstruction was shaped by the history books that they had read in high school. And the history books that they had read in high school described Reconstruction as a disaster because the blacks were in control of the state legislatures in Reconstruction, and they didn't know enough about democracy to do a good job of it. Lowen laments that description of the situation because, in his opinion, it was anything but. First, the state legislatures were in control by a consortium of blacks and whites, and the whites almost universally were in control of the legislatures. Moreover, there were several state legislatures that did a very good job in managing the state and establishing statewide public education for all students. So that was a couple of examples. I'm trying to think of the third. My projectors decided to ignore me. Go on. Let's come back on. Okay. I think my projector is telling me that it's time to get to Abbey Martin, so let's do that. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. This is the right one. That other one I want to watch sometime soon. Abbey did some very good work in Venezuela, and we have been told a story about Maduro and Guaido, and Guaido supposedly is the legitimate president, and Maduro was not in fact elected. This is what Abbey has to tell us.
For the last few weeks, the world's focus has been on Venezuela as Trump pushes for regime change. Almost every media outlet paints the same picture, that Venezuela is a brutal dictatorship and a starving nation, one that demands intervention, and that they finally have a solution to the crisis, a legitimate claim to power by an opposition politician, Juan Guaido.
As civil society collapses, America confronts the socialist dictatorship.
Maduro stole the previous election. He locked up and he tortured anyone trying to unseat him.
There's no toilet paper some days in Caracas. They're eating zoo animals. What happened? Well, you know what happened. They implemented socialism.
The eyes of the revolution are everywhere. President Maduro's militia still trying to keep the people in line.
Guaido is investing in the people, whereas Nicolas Maduro is investing in the army.
So this is a neighborhood Juan Guaido feels safe in. This is one of the wealthier neighborhoods of Caracas.
Despite the faux dissent against Trump's domestic policies, the corporate media has lined up to support his coup in Venezuela. Tech giants like Facebook and Twitter are doing their part to shape the narrative too, recently removing 2,000 accounts for spreading pro-Maduro messaging to, quote, influence people.
Would you personally negotiate with Nicolas Maduro to convince him to exit?
Well, he has requested a meeting, and I've turned it down because we're very far along in the process.
Trump has said a military option is on the table, with coup leader Juan Guaido suggesting he will request it.
People don't recognize that Hezbollah has active cells
the Iranians are impacting the people of Venezuela. We have an obligation to take down that risk for America.
All options are on the table.
All options are on the table.
All options are on the table.
The United States now looks forward to watching each corner of the triangle fall, in Havana, in Caracas, in Managua.
The days of socialism and communism are numbered.
Libertad, libertad, libertad.
Their latest cynical stunt is weaponizing aid to hold Maduro's government hostage. In the latest war escalation, the U.S. announced the delivery of so-called aid via military aircraft to the border.
It's an abomination to humanity to stop basic necessities and goods from entering your country to help your own people.
Is there any concern that something like this would provoke him from doing something even more drastic?
What happens if he doesn't let that aid through?
Well, look, the aid is going to get through. And I think ultimately the question is whether it gets through in a way that he's cooperative with or in a way that he's not.
From Iraq to Libya to Venezuela, what usually preempts U.S. military intervention is the pretext of a humanitarian crisis. And right now, pretty much everyone speaks with authority about the fact that there is a human rights crisis caused by the Maduro government. What is surprisingly absent from the discourse is testimony from the human rights investigator designated by the UN to assess said crisis. Alfred de Zayas was the first UN investigator to go to Venezuela in 21 years. He has written 13 reports for the UN Human Rights Council, but his report on Venezuela was largely ignored. I spoke with Alfred to find out why.
If you know a humanitarian crisis in Gaza and in Yemen, and in Syria, and in Sudan, and in Somalia, you wouldn't say there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And at no point when I was walking the streets in Venezuela did I feel threatened, or did I see violence, or did I consider that this country was undergoing a humanitarian crisis. But I see human rights more and more being instrumentalized to destroy human rights. There is a weaponization of human rights. I see the rule of law being instrumentalized to destroy the rule of law, and unfortunately, the complicity of the mainstream media. What I'm saying to you, I think it would have been sensible to say it to the BBC. It would have been sensible to say it to the New York Times and to the Washington Post and to The Economist and to the Financial Times. But at no time since I returned from Venezuela and since my report was officially presented to the Human Rights Council have I been approached by any of these organs who actually have a responsibility vis-a-vis you and vis-a-vis me and vis-a-vis the people of the United States to inform.
You know, many people will say the crisis cannot be blamed on the sanctions, of course, that sanctions are being used as a scapegoat for Maduro's economic failures. Alfred, talk about the impacts of the sanctions thus far and the new sanctions that were just implemented on the state oil company.
What is particularly Machiavellian, what is particularly cynical, is to cause an economic crisis that threatens to become a humanitarian crisis. That's what the United States has done through the financial blockade, through the sanctions, and then to say, oh, we're going to offer you humanitarian help. We're sending so and so many tons of humanitarian assistance through U.S. aid. We're sending it to Colombia, and we're going to deliver it. Now, I think that here Juan Guaidó is being shall we say, the jockey. He is riding on the Trojan horse of the United States. But the solution of the problem is much easier than the Band-Aid of sending some packages of food or of medicine. The solution is in my report. What I told the Human Rights Council is that the financial blockade has had extremely adverse human rights impacts. Obviously, the origin of the current economic crisis is in the fall, the dramatic fall in the price of oil. But normally you would be able to fix that. A country as wealthy as Venezuela should have been able to borrow money on its enormous natural resources and then would have been able to buy and sell like anybody else. But no, the United States has made sure that because of the threat of enormous penalties to the U.S. Treasury, the banks have been closing the accounts of the Venezuelan government and of the Petróleos of Venezuela. Already in July 2017, Citibank unexpectedly decided, without prior notice and arbitrarily, to close the bank accounts of the Central Bank of Venezuela and the Bank of Venezuela in November 2017. Citibank blocked the transfer for a shipment of more than 300,000 doses of insulin. In November 2017, the company Euroclear retained $1.65 billion that the Venezuelan government had paid for the purchase of food and medicine. Citgo, the Venezuelan state oil company based in the U.S., has not been able to transfer its profits outside the United States of America. It needs that money to buy food and medicine. And it is in the neighborhood, I think, by now of $9 or $10 billion that have been withheld. There again, Wells Fargo Bank withheld and canceled payment of $7,500,000 made by Brazil to Venezuela for the sale of electricity. In May 2018, the Venezuelan Minister of People's Power informed that a financial transaction amounting to $7 million for the purchase of dialysis supplies for patients, including children and adolescents, requiring such treatment had been blocked. So you see here the immorality of it, but not only the immorality of it, there is personal criminal liability for the impact of these sanctions. I mean, I am certain that the increase in child mortality, the increase in maternal mortality, the increased deaths for lack of insulin or lack of antiretroviral drugs is a direct result of this blockage, so that Venezuela has not been able to purchase what its people deserve. It's not like the government doesn't want to distribute. It's that the government is being, through an external economic war, is being asphyxiated. And that was the name of the game. What the United States intended to do was to create a situation whereby the people or the military would topple the government, and then the 1% could again come in and could again control the wealth of Venezuela. Venezuela had succeeded in bringing millions and millions of Venezuelans out of extreme poverty. Nobody cared in the 1980s and 90s that there were millions of Venezuelans dying of hunger and malnutrition. No one cared. It was a government that was palatable to Washington, and a government that was a right-wing government. The moment that a left-wing government came in power, priority number one in Washington was to topple it.
And now you have the Bank of England seizing the gold, right, from Maduro, over $1 billion worth, and threatening to give it to Juan Guaido.
That's yet another violation of international law. But try to bring the United States before the International Criminal Court or before the International Court of Justice. What I think is important now would be for the General Assembly to adopt a resolution condemning the sanctions and asking that the sanctions be lifted because sanctions kill. I would also like to see the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court investigate to what extent the deaths already occurred in connection with the sanctions amount to a violation of Article 7 of the Statute of Rome. Article 7 defines crimes against humanity. Now, when you deliberately impose sanctions and financial blockades and an economic war that asphyxiates a country's economy and thereby make it very difficult for that country to provide the necessary food and medicines to its population, and as a consequence, thousands of people die, you have a case of crime against humanity. But the narrative in the mainstream press completely ignores it. When they refer to a humanitarian crisis, they put the entire fault on the government, and they say, well, socialism is a proven failure. Socialism will never work. Therefore, you have to have regime change.
Juan Guaido swore himself in and was backed by the rest of the free world.
And he has been recognized as such by the rational half of the world.
Now a long list of countries joining the U.S. supporting Guaido.
The sea of yellow you see there now recognizes the opposition leader, Juan Guaido.
This coup is painted as legitimate by the media and political establishment because of the international support from major U.S. allies in Europe and Latin America. But let's take a quick look around the world to see what that support really looks like. As usual, the African continent is erased from the dialogue. There, 51 countries recognize Maduro. Only one, Morocco, recognizes Guaido. Then there's Asia and Oceania, where again, only Australia recognizes Guaido. The other 33 nations recognize Maduro. Moving on to the Middle East, where staunch U.S. ally Israel is the only country to recognize Guaido. The rest in the region continue to support Maduro's presidency. Next, the Americas and the Caribbean. Despite 17 countries across the continent recognizing Guaido, 19 countries still support Maduro. While the majority of U.S. allied Latin American powers back Guaido, in the Caribbean, the Bahamas is the only nation to do so. Lastly, there's Europe. Powers like France, Britain, and Germany have united behind the U.S. to support their puppet in Venezuela. Even so, stark opposition to this coup exists within Europe, including Italy, Greece, Norway, Switzerland, and the Vatican. So by international community, they really just mean a minority led by the white imperialist and colonizer nations, erasing non-white nations as members of the international community. How is this coup a violation of international law?
Well, international law has been violated by the United States by interfering in the internal affairs of states. The United Nations Charter is fairly clear, especially in Articles 1 and 2, where the sovereign equality of states is guaranteed, where the right of self-determination of all peoples is guaranteed. The thing is, it's not for the United Nations to decide this is the better government. People determine their governments. That is the democratic way to go about it. And Article 2, Paragraph 3 says that if there's any dispute among states, those disputes shall be solved peacefully through peaceful negotiation. And then Article 2, Paragraph 4 prohibits not only the use of force, but the threat of the use of force. And Trump has been saying again and again that the military option is on the table. Well, the military option is a major violation of international law.
The corporate media has dutifully parroted the Pentagon line that a guy who 80% of Venezuelans had never heard of before was a legitimate leader seeking to restore democracy. So who is Juan Guaido, the lucky 35-year-old man just anointed king? Well, before this coup attempt, Guaidó was much better known in elite U.S. circles than he was in his home country of Venezuela. He received graduate degrees from prestigious D.C. University, George Washington, where he studied under a former IMF director, as well as attended private business school in Caracas. Guaidó's roots are in the militant wing of the opposition as an organizer in the violent street protests known as guarimbas. Channeling energy from these protests, he founded right-wing opposition party Popular Will, alongside opposition leader Leopoldo López. López has been martyred as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International and is painted as a hero across Western media, allegedly banished for opposing the regime. In reality, he's on mere house arrest for leading violent street insurrections that left dozens dead. He was also part of the US-backed coup in 2002. Both are deeply connected to US regime change front groups like USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. By 2010, international agencies were generously pouring up to $50 million per year into funding the Venezuelan opposition movement. With López out of commission, Guaidó has been groomed to replace him. Guaidó even admitted there's not a single thing he does without López's guidance. According to the Wall Street Journal, Guaidó's declaration as president was planned by López and just 3 other opposition leaders, 2 of whom are not even in Venezuela, and came as a complete surprise to the rest of the coalition. Even Guaidó was reportedly hesitant to make the move, and it was the phone call from Mike Pence the day before that gave him the reassurance he needed. As a White House official explained to the Washington Post, "We have been engaged with the same strategy, to build international pressure, help organize the internal opposition, and push for a peaceful restoration of democracy. But that internal piece was missing," the official said. Guaidó was the piece we needed for our strategy to be coherent and complete. Sounds like a pretty open and shut case of a US CIA regime change plot. But all of their rhetoric is about the restoration of democracy. So let's take a look at that claim. Here's the most common explanation.
Maduro's political ambition became evident.
I'm going to stop it there. Abbey has done a very good job with this. The point that she is making is that Americans have been told that Guaidó is legitimate and Maduro is not, and the evidence on the ground is exactly 180 degrees removed from that. Maybe that's just one example. Well, it turns out that what American journalists have been telling us about Syria is also essentially 180 degrees removed from what is actually is and was happening on the ground in Syria in the last 6 years. 2 very courageous and intelligent journalists, Ava Bartlett and Vanessa Beeley, are obviously with their names both female, but they both speak Arabic. And instead of going to the international briefings delivered by military personnel, these people went to the villages that were under fire. They went to villages that had been liberated, and in some cases they went to villages that were occupied, and they spoke with people. Let me show you some of the things that Ava Bartlett found out. She's talking with Jimmy Dore, so Jimmy does a good job of interviewing, so let's go with this.
Everybody, welcome. We have a special guest. You might recognize her from her previous appearance on this show. She's a great journalist doing some really great reporting that's coming out of Syria. Not many reporters are actually even going to Syria. She's one of the few, and she's given us the truth about what's been happening in Syria. She's an independent journalist from Canada. Please welcome my guest, Eva Bartlett. Hi, Eva. How are you?
Hi, Jimmy. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
So now you really did some groundbreaking reporting on this. Can you just tell briefly what's the biggest misconceptions that people have who, if they've been watching the mainstream media, what would be their biggest misconceptions about what's happening in Syria?
That there's something called a civil war or some entity called rebels in Syria that are fighting against this caricaturized evil regime that is gunning down his people and gassing his people. And I mean, some of the latest lies do revolve around chemical weapons allegations. So the main mythology is that this is all about a popular uprising against the president.
But it's not a popular uprising against the president because it was the CIA and lots of other outside actors, correct, that fomented this through the Arab Spring. Then they kind of brought in outside actors, meaning people supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the CIA also. Is that correct? Is that what's really been happening?
Absolutely. And I mean, you have documents from the mid-2000s, you have documents even from the 80s when prior attempts at regime change were enacted. But even taking like this current attempt at regime change, I would highly recommend a Canadian author named Stephen Gowans, who wrote a very thorough article called The Revolutionary Distemper in Syria That Wasn't. And the reason I recommend him is that he links to, well, he gives a lot of historical context. He links to these documents and also to actual, surprisingly, corporate media reporters who were on the ground in early 2011 and who were reporting prior to March 2011, which is what we're told were the revolution, the so-called unarmed protest kicked off. He was citing corporate media, New York Times, Time magazine, saying, actually, there's not much will for protest here.
Oh, no kidding. I will check that out. Thanks for the heads up on that. I know that I played on this show a video of an interview between Christiane Amanpour from CNN with Assad from 2005, where she was warning him that everybody wanted to overthrow him already and that regime change was the word of the day from the West. So what do you, I wasn't really following the news back then, 12 years ago, that closely, is certainly not as it related to Syria. But do you know what the justification back in like 2005 was that the United States and the West was giving for regime change in Syria back then?
Likewise, like yourself, I wasn't following the news, and I fully admit, back then I was utterly apolitical. But I mean, the documents that trace back, to after September 11th, and even prior to, again, referring to Gowan's article, he gets into how the Washington or the West did not like the socialist Ba'athist government in Syria. And so they had desire to implement a new government which would, acquiesce to their demands on, allowing different international companies in there, extracting oil and natural resources, ending Syria's long-standing support for Palestinians, and support for Hezbollah and other allies, and having Syria make peace with Israel, which is occupying the Syrian Golan and which has warred upon, including recently, many times, Syria. Related to the 2000s, we have the famous kind of speech by General Wesley Clark saying Syria was on the hit list along with 6 or 7 other nations. And there's other documentation, again referring to Gowan's article, that after September 11th, Syria was put on the hit list, the so-called axis of evil, or whatever, cartoon words they were using back then.
I cannot quote all of the nations, but you'll remember the interview that was given by a retired general who had visited the Pentagon a few days after the events of 9/11, and he was told that we'll be going to war with 7 nations, the last of which was going to be Iran, the first of which was going to be Iraq, and Libya and Syria were on the same list. So the neoconservative intention to change the administration of each of these countries goes back at least to 2001, and based on 2 documents goes back to the mid-1990s.
Or whatever, cartoonish.
Yes.
I think Max Blumenthal makes a pretty compelling argument for, both Libya and Syria, the regime change motivation is covered up, like she's saying.
Oh, yes.
But in trying to get regime change brought about, our government, and especially our CIA, has been using terrorists. Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and even has given support to ISIS because they'd rather have them win than have Assad win.
Basically, the United States and the neoconservative movement have been using volunteer armies and paying them, and they are getting their volunteers from Wahhabi extremists, not only from Saudi Arabia, but primarily from Saudi Arabia, also from extremists Muslim extremists from Afghanistan. If you point to a person who's an agnostic or atheist or even a Christian, they are an enemy because they don't believe in your God.
But still, way back to when we were fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And Saudi Arabia was part of this, pouring billions of dollars to support the Mujahideen, which basically was a right-wing extremist.
Because it was Brzezinski's intention.
They came from 40 different countries, and then once we defeated the Soviet Union, they were going all over the world. And including our CIA was using them. Yeah.
We are hearing nowadays about concentration camps in Western China. These concentration camps are, in point of fact, re-education centers and I want to say normalization camps for Uyghurs who have been indoctrinated, and they're trying to unindoctrinate these extremist Muslims because they don't want they don't want this kind of turmoil in their own land. Quite reasonably, the United States put peaceable Japanese Americans in concentration camps who didn't have a doctrine. At least the Chinese have some real reason for treating the Uyghurs as suspect. They are not being tortured. They are undergoing re-education and basically reculturalization.
I mean, I think China's still off the rails there too, but...
Well, I do...
but I don't know. I haven't been there.
I understand.
To see it.
Words they were using back then. Certainly, and this is something I think most cognizant people would recognize, it has nothing to do with freedom, democracy, or human rights in Syria, particularly when you consider currently, and since 2011, the allies of the West, the ones that have been funding and funneling in terrorists into Syria, be they Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel.
So what got you interested in covering Syria? How did that come about? Because a lot of people have been, since you're actually reporting facts that counter the mainstream established news media and our government, people have been impugning your character all over the place. And so just tell everybody here now what got you interested in Syria, and how did you come about to go there?
Sure. I would just note first, I think that if I towed the line, used the rhetoric of the corporate media and the NATO propagandists, including Amanpour, people would be celebrating me and I'd be wealthy. But because I'm reporting as I see it and I don't have an agenda and nobody's paying me to say what I say, I am being vilified, as you're surely aware. But basically, when things were kicking off in Syria, I had no prior knowledge of Syria. I had no misconceptions or preconceptions about Syria. And I was living in Gaza, in occupied Palestine at the time, doing activism there, trying to bring awareness to the, truly horrifying plight of Palestinians under brutal siege and random bombings and massacres. But so, that said, when things started in 2011, I was also enduring the same power outages as Palestinians in Gaza. I wasn't well informed, but at some point in 2011 and 2012, I started paying very close attention, reading a variety of sources, consulting friends and analysts who I respected, and felt like something was really wrong with what we were being told was happening in Syria. In March 2013, I left Gaza, finally, and went back to Canada. I started asking Syrian Canadians, and their replies to my questions on what was happening in Syria were very interesting, because many of them said, when things started in 2011, we were hopeful. We wanted change. We wanted political change in Syria. Some of us went back to Syria and supported the demonstrations. But very quickly on, they and people in Syria that I later encountered and interviewed said, what we saw was not political change. These were brutal protests. These were thuggish protests, not demanding actual political reforms. So, knowing what I was hearing from people I trusted in Canada, and then going in 2014, April 2014, for my first time to Syria, hearing a narrative that was in stark contrast to what we were being told by corporate media, really, I'm sure like yourself, motivated me to do as much as possible to shed some truth on really a vacuum of, lies and manufactured media around Syria.
So if those protests didn't want political change, those thuggish protests that we now find out, many of them were outside agitators, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, people being funded by the CIA, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. So now, what were the point of those thuggish protests if they weren't for political change?
Well, I mean, some of the initial protests did call for certain things like the end to the emergency law in Syria, the release of political prisoners. And this is an important note because these so-called political prisoners included people who were active in the 80s, including Muslim Brotherhood people. And many of these so-called political prisoners went on to join the so-called rebels and have become violent leaders or part of these different Al-Qaeda affiliated or Al-Qaeda, working with Al-Qaeda groups. Some of the other demands included the lifting of certain laws that pertain to Syria's, and this is, sorry, Jimmy, but this is why I do refer back to the Stephen Gowan's article, because he gives the context of decades prior, what was happening, various attempts of CIA coup d'etats, Syria being at war with Israel, and the fact that, yes, it was an authoritarian government, but there are reasons for it.
I'm going to stop there. You get the idea, and I want to show you Eva Bartlett because I didn't want you to walk out on me. But that's Eva Bartlett. I want to show you a bit from Vanessa Beeley. I'm sorry, I thought I had Vanessa Beeley down here as well. But the point is that actually there are three very responsible reporters who are telling us what was and is going on in Syria, and it is diametrically opposed to the story that you are getting from the American media. Why is it opposed to what you are getting in the American media? Because the American media are stenographers for the United States government. That is the worst situation it has been. It started, I call your attention to Udo Ulfkotte, U-L-F-K-O-T-T-E. I've mentioned this to the gentleman who is teaching the German class, since he is fluent in German. Udo Ulfkotte was a German journalist who was bought. And his indication is that every major journalist in Western Europe, and presumably also every major journalist in the United States, is on the payroll, directly or indirectly. It's also worth pointing out that Jeffrey Epstein was not above gathering information and small children for people whom he wanted or whom his employers wanted to have incriminated. So it would not surprise me at all if some of the journalists were cooperating with the American narrative because of compulsion. In any case, the story that Americans are getting about world history, contemporary world history, and America's involvement in it is impossibly false, and it makes it impossible for an American to understand why the rest of the world looks at us the way they do. The title of last week's or a couple weeks ago program was, can the major media be trusted, or words to that effect? They can be trusted to tell you the story that they're told to tell you.
You know, I've recently read about a guy named William Arkin, who was Arkin was a longtime reporter with NBC and MSNBC, And he resigned in absolute disgust. He said, it has become, this is what I remember, it has become a propaganda arm for the Pentagon, FBI, and CIA, NSA. And it was good to know there was somebody that couldn't stand to keep on doing that.
Well, it started long before 1967. It was, certain major publishers were already in league with the CIA and the NSA long before the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, yeah.
But it became at least somewhat public knowledge when the CIA document that was sent out to its assets in 1967 instructing their assets how to deal with skeptics about the Warren Commission. And their approach has been very, very effective. Before 1967, conspiracy was a well-known and well-respected legal concept, and it was mentioned maybe once a month in popular magazines and news media. After 1967, it was mentioned with much greater frequency, and the American people were taught, and I'm using that word intentionally, the American people were taught to be skeptical and to make fun of people who employ conspiracy theories.
It's a dirty word.
Yeah, it's now a laughingstock, but as a legal concept, it's well known and well respected. Questions, comments? Thank you.
I'll ask my question now.